There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's November 1988 in California, and police are on the doorstep of a boarding house on F Street in downtown Sacramento. They're chatting to Dorothea Puente, an older, grandmotherly type who runs the house caring for elderly, disabled and vulnerable. A local social worker has filed a missing persons report for a 51-year-old Alvaro Bert Montoya who lives at the address. Bert has schizophrenia and needs a bit of extra support in his living situation. Dorothea's boarding house had appeared like a great fit. She lived on the premises, she cooked for her boarders, and to the outside world, she appeared to be a wonderful, caring person. But Judy, the social worker, had been getting increasingly worried. At first, Dorothea told her Bert was in Mexico with her brother. Then, she was told his relatives had come to pick him up and he no longer lived at the Sacramento address. Judy was suspicious. So she tracked down one of the other boarders, a man named John Sharp.
I said, John, what's going on with Bert? He said, he's not there anymore. And I said, did you go to Mexico? He said, none of us went to Mexico, no. And then I said, so tell me about where you live, like, is something wrong? He said, yeah, something is wrong here. She's been digging a lot of holes.
As officers searched the boarding house, and all of the tenants gave them the same answer, Bert left with a relative. John did something brazen. He slipped an officer a note, scrawled on the back of an envelope. It was just one sentence. She wants me to lie to you. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Dorothea Puente wasn't the frail, kind, old grandma she perceived herself to be. She was a serial killer, allegedly murdering up to 9 people while running a boarding house in Sacramento. I say alleged because she was only convicted of 3 murder charges, despite 11 of the 12 jurors in her trial wanting her to go down for all 9. The prosecution didn't have a confession. Dorothea admitted to cashing in her tenants' checks, but her claim was they died in their sleep. They were sick. She buried them because she couldn't call authorities because she was violating her parole running an illegal boarding house.
There was one juror that maybe believed her story that they died naturally, and he decided that he wasn't going to find her guilty on any more than 3 murders.
He also probably was one of the last people that had fallen for the older grandmotherly, innocuous, harmless kind of look.
Dubbed the Death House Landlady by the press at the time, 7 people, former tenants, were found in Dorothea's backyard. She was linked to 2 other deaths. One of a friend who it was thought previously died by suicide, and a lover whose body was found near a nearby river. The victims ranged in age from 51 to 78. Dorothea was benefiting from their social security and disability checks. After her conviction and subsequent sentence, Dorothea died in prison in 2011 after serving 23 years behind bars. Even there, she managed to win over people with her sweet grandmotherly ruse. Author Jeannie Ortiz has written a book called The Corpse Collector, the true story of Dorothea Puente, the boarding house killer. In it, she unpacks the life and crimes of Dorothea, as well as the complexities of her lies, cover-ups and multiple fake personalities. Jeannie joins us now. Jeannie, let's start with a visual description. What did Dorothea Puente look like in the 1980s?
Well, when you hear the word Granny. What do you imagine? You imagine a little blue-haired old lady, big glasses, walks with a cane. She wears a lot of florals and cardigans. She has like a soft little voice, and she bakes cookies, and everyone loves her. She is just this great, sweet, nice lady.
Let's go back to the start of her story. What do we know about her background? Did she have quite a troubled childhood?
Oh, definitely. She was born in Redlands, California in 1929. She was the seventh out of 8 children. Her father was James Gray. He was a World War I veteran who, in a mustard gas attack, developed lung issues for the rest of his life. So he was just constantly in pain. He was heavily traumatized. Her mother was Trudy Mae Gray, and she was someone who had 8 children, but never took to motherhood. She just did not like being around her kids. She was not maternal. She went on benders. She worked as a sex worker sometimes to make ends meet, and was just not a warm maternal figure, not someone who was like cut out to be a mother, just did not have that about her.
And they died, both of them, quite young. They died quite early in Dorothea's life anyway.
Yes. She was, I believe, in her early teens. Her father died in 1937. He died of tuberculosis that developed as a result of his lung issues. And she had kind of been expecting him to die like before that many, many times, because he often threatened suicide in front of his children, once by threatening to jump off of a water tower and once by threatening to shoot himself in the head in front of them.
Yeah, that's a really violent thing to hear as a young kid.
Yeah. Then in 1938, her mother ran off with a lover, and she died in a motorcycle accident, and her children actually did not find out about her death until they were dropped off at the funeral.
That's insane. So what happened to the children? What happened to Dorothea? Because she was still a young teenager at this point.
Yeah, the children were divided up among other family members. Dorothea and her younger brother, because she had one younger sibling, were sent to an orphanage. And imagine what conditions were like for an average person during the Great Depression. Now imagine that in an orphanage. I believe she was sexually abused there. She didn't have enough to eat. Just a miserable, miserable time for someone who was already never had a very happy life. For some time, she lived with one of her older siblings, and she attended high school for only about a year. And something that I found very interesting is that she pretended to be Portuguese because her brother's wife was a Portuguese woman. Like, she would pretend to not really be able to speak English, so other people would have to like help her with her work.
Oh, bizarre.
It is very bizarre, and that's just like one of the first in a long, long line of very bizarre lies that she told.
Well, isn't it later on that a doctor diagnoses her as basically being a pathological liar? I guess that would be the start of that, right?
Yes.
So what other things did she lie about in those early years?
She lied about her parents being Mexican nationals. She said that, I was one of 18 children. Or she would say, my parents were royalty. Yeah, just very, very bizarre claims that nowadays something like that can be very easily disproven. But like in the 1930s and 40s, you kind of just had to be like, that doesn't sound right, but okay.
Yeah, there's no Google, no social media to kind of stalk someone, is there?
Nope.
She was married 4 times, the first time by the age of 16. Tell us about that first marriage. She did have 2 kids with her first husband.
So around that time, she was working as a sex worker. Obviously, she didn't really go to school. She didn't have any like skills to fall back on. I believe she worked at an ice cream parlor at the same time, but to make ends meet, she took up sex work. And one of her clients was a young man in his 20s who had just come back from World War II. His name was Fred McFall. And they married in 1945. And he didn't really have a lot of positive things to say about her other than, well, she was very good looking. But She was 16. She wasn't ready to be a wife. She had expensive tastes, so he worked as a bartender to try to keep up with like things she wanted. In 1946, she had her first daughter. The first daughter was sent to live with McFall's family. The second daughter, who was born in 1948, was put up for adoption.
Why?
She was never able to bond with any of her children, which is very strange considering her relationships with children down the line. She just could not handle motherhood. Like, she had no maternal feelings. She just couldn't bond.
It's terribly sad, though.
It is.
So we mentioned she was married another 3 times. Her second marriage, is that where the fake persona kind of came in?
Actually, I believe that her fake persona might have started with McFall. There is some records of her going by the name Sherry Ale. 1952, that's when she married a sea merchant named Axel Johansson, and she started calling herself Tea Singoala Nayarda. She pretended to be a Muslim woman who was of Egyptian and Israeli descent.
So her husband, her second husband, thought that that's what her background was?
Yes.
And how long were they married? That's a big ruse to kind of carry on.
Yes, this was her largest marriage. They were married until 1966, so like more than 14 years, I believe.
And she kept it up the whole time?
Yes. I believe personally that her husband just at some point figured out, oh, this is all a lie. And he had her committed to a psychiatric hospital in 1961. That's where she was diagnosed as a pathological liar with an unstable personality.
So her third and fourth marriages, they didn't last quite as long?
Oh, no. She later on married a 21-year-old named Roberto Jose Puente, where she got the last name Puente from. And I believe they were married for 2 weeks, and immediately the people that knew Dorothea started saying, yeah, that's not going to last, because Roberto Puente was a womanizer, and he was seemingly only with Dorothea for her money, because at that point in her life, she had started building this persona of a philanthropist and like a very like giving, charitable person. So this 21-year-old immigrant sees her, and he's like, oh, that's my ticket to an easy life. So things fell apart as soon as he realized that it was all a ruse.
She did start having brushes with crime and police and jail from quite an early age. What did it start with?
Oh, yes. Right after she and McFall separated, she became friends with another young woman, and she somehow got a hold of this woman's paychecks. So in 1948, she went to a department store and tried to buy what would be around $1,000 worth in today's currency of shoes at a department store. But right as she was paying, she kind of chickened out, and the clerk realized something was wrong, and the police were called. And she was trying to flee on bus when they captured her. And she was seen by a doctor for the first time in her life as a part of the investigation. And the psychiatrist determined that she had impulse control issues, but that she was not in danger. So she pled guilty to 2 counts of forgery. And she served 4 months in prison and got 3 years probation.
And then she had some run-ins with an illegal brothel situation?
Yes. In 1960 in Sacramento, when she was still married to the sea merchant Axel Johansson, under the guise of running a bookkeeping business, she opened up a brothel. And people started to get suspicious. Where was all this money coming from? People saw that she didn't really have any legitimate clients. So police went in undercover and they were arrested, but since it was a nonviolent crime and she was very, very good at getting people to sympathize with her, she pretty much got off scot-free.
So we know that she's a liar. We know that she's very good at manipulating people. What else could you find out about her personality and what kind of person she was, especially throughout those marriages and those early years? Were you able to determine what kind of woman she was?
I believe she was someone who was just very, very unhappy. And she told these grand lies as a way of protecting herself from reality, to the point where she really started to believe these things. But the problem was that she had so many wild stories that they started to contradict each other. I read one of the sources describing her as kind of an empty vessel. There's so much on the surface, but deep down inside of her, not even she knew who she was.
So following her third divorce, she starts running a boarding house in Sacramento. How did she get involved with that, and what did the boarding house situation look like?
So, in the late 60s and 70s, she bought an old Victorian house on 21st and F Street in Sacramento. The precursor to this boarding house was a halfway house that she ran around the time she was married to Roberto Puente. She was able to get away with this because she did not accept anyone who needed specialized care. She did not give medications, and she only took in a few people at a time. But when that was broken up after a domestic violence incident with Roberto Puente, the social workers pulled everyone out, but she was not one to give up. She opened up her first boarding house in the early 70s, and she began to administer medication, something that she had not been qualified to do. And she also started taking Social Security checks from her tenants. And she created sort of I guess you could describe it as a caste system in her boarding house, where the tenants who could provide her with more money, they got private rooms, private restrooms, a color television, 3 meals a day. Everyone else was kept in the basement. Their living conditions were only separated by a thin curtain, like these little cubicles with just a curtain separating them. Literally kept in the dark.
And these people that she was taking in, they were more vulnerable members of the society? Who were they?
Yeah, so she started off mostly dealing with alcoholics. Some of her other tenants included a young man who had a brain injury. And since he needed help, but he was still mostly functioning at a normal level, she sometimes put him in charge when she was out and about. But yeah, any like down and out an alcoholic with severe issues, she would take in. If they had a condition that was severe enough to warrant getting on disability, which in America is very, very hard to do, she would take them in.
For a little bit more of a wider context, was she and this boarding house in high demand? Because there was quite an issue with, I guess, poverty, homeless people in Sacramento at the time.
Yes, California has always had an issue with homelessness, given that it's such a large state, and funding for mental health services was not great. So Sacramento around the 70s and 80s saw a huge spike in homelessness. So social workers, not wanting to send their clients to these overrun shelters where they'd be sleeping on the floor, were really hoping to get them into this boarding house run by this nice woman who prepared the meals herself and like helped them. She was described as being kind of a disciplinarian. She always saw that their basic needs were met, but she didn't take kindly to them wandering in drunk. So she offered like a balance to her tenants and developed what seemed like a very genuine human connection with her tenants. Like she seemed to very genuinely care about them as individuals, which was the impression that the social workers got.
And that grandmotherly vibe that we described at the top of this interview, is that something that she kind of leaned into more when these boarding houses were happened? Because wasn't she like lying about her age? She wasn't as old as she dressed to be?
Yes. Essentially, this costume that she put on, this started when she had just turned 40. And when she was younger, she was known for being like this very beautiful young woman. But as soon as she hit that age, she was like, okay, I'm going to lean into more matronly clothes. She bought long cardigans, floral dresses. She let her hair go gray. And just these big grandma glasses that she wore that made her look smaller than she was. She just cultivated this persona of someone who was very, very harmless.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Bath. I'm speaking with writer Jeannie Ortiz about Dorothea Puente, the boarding house killer. So this boarding house situation that she'd set up, she did get caught by the police, didn't she? What happened when officers kind of worked out what she was doing?
So, in 1977, a former tenant of hers was in prison, but he was still supposed to be receiving a disability check. And he started to getting impatient until he found out that his check had already been cashed, which confused him because he did not remember ever even seeing it, much less signing it. And he found out that the checks were still being sent to the boarding house where he had lived for 3 years. So he reported it, and Dorothea kept trying to convince authorities, like, oh, well, he gave me permission. Like, he saw me signing them and sending them off. And they did not buy it. And a deeper investigation saw that she had actually forged 34 checks. That's what she was convicted of, forging 34 checks.
Of different people?
Different people, different tenants. Because by this time, her reputation had started growing of her being like this very generous landlady. And she had to fund that lifestyle somehow. She was using different checks from all her tenants because a single disability check is barely enough to live on. But if she has a whole pool of them, then she can fund this more extravagant lifestyle and be able to construct this image of herself as someone who has the means to be charitable at all times. She presented herself almost like as someone who would like have this endless amount to give, someone whose cup never ran dry, if that makes sense.
So we know she had a history of this forging of checks, but then in the 80s she gets another conviction, and it's to do with drugging people. So it's kind of like she's kind of stepped up a notch. What was she doing?
When she got out of prison for the forgery, she was not allowed to go back to running a boarding house. So she took to being an in-home caregiver, which gave her access to all kinds of medications. Among the first of her crimes happened in January of 1982. She went to a bar known as the Zebra Club, and there she met 74-year-old Malcolm Mackenzie. They shared a drink. They went back to his house, and she slipped him something that immediately caused severe nausea and paralysis in him. So he laid down on the couch, feeling unwell, and watched as she rummaged through his house. She even stole a ring right off his pinky finger. And he could just lay there and not do anything about it. And then she just left. And he wanted to report her, but it was kind of a he said, she said situation. She presented this argument that, oh, well, he wanted to have his way with me and I rejected him, so now he's trying to spite me. So it was very difficult to build a case on that. It wasn't thrown out, but it came to a standstill. Around that same time, she had been building a friendship with a married couple. The husband, Harold Monroe, was suffering from cancer. So Dorothea became close with his wife, Ruth Monroe. And, out of this other woman's tragedy, Dorothea was able to get close to her and convince her, like, oh, well, we should follow our dreams while we're still here. Like, their dream was to start some kind of food business. Some sources refer to it as a cafe. Some refer to it as a catering business. But Dorothea convinced Ruth to basically put all her money, all of her savings into this venture. Dorothea was like, well, I'll do all the cooking. You can just handle supplies. And Ruth, being very vulnerable and wanting friendship, just kind of went along with it. And when Harold was growing worse. His cancer was progressing. He was moved to a veterans hospital. Dorothea convinced Ruth to move in with her in order to save money. And that is when she started basically just stealing everything from this other woman. And Ruth was not known to have been a heavy drinker, yet every time her children came to see her at Dorothea's residency, she was drinking a creme de menthe. And not only was she drinking, but she also seemed unwell. Her son came to visit one day, and Ruth was just in a very, very bad state. She looked like she had been crying. But he reassured her, well, Dorothea will take care of you. Like, she has a medical background, and she could not communicate how much she wanted to get away from Dorothea because she was basically paralyzed. She was starving. She had nothing in her but the creme de menthe. So in late April 1982, she passed away. And originally, it was thought to be a suicide because she had a large amount of sleeping pills in her system. But her children immediately took issue with that because Ruth had been a devout Catholic, and there was never like any sign that she might have been suicidal. But at the same time, the police considered, well, her husband is dying, her savings are gone. It's not impossible that she could have done this to herself. And they couldn't prove that she had been murdered or anything, so that case also came to a standstill.
Something interesting that I just picked up on you saying was the claim that Dorothea had a medical background. Was that true?
She did not, unsurprisingly. I believe the extent of her knowledge came from reading books. When she had her first boarding house, she did administer vitamin shots, and she took to calling herself La Doctora, which translates to the doctor. And she was somehow so convincing that an actual medical doctor was convinced of her credentials because she did have like fake certificates hanging on her wall. So he kind of took her on as a business partner, and they made house calls, or they had patients come to her quote unquote office and she would assist him. He did find that she had a very short temper, but he kind of just chalked it all up to, well, she's dealing with drunks all the time. Of course, like, her patience is going to run thin.
So you keep talking about the first boarding house. So even though she wasn't allowed to, she formed a second one that was basically unlicensed, right? Which is where all of these murders end up happening.
Yes. The story of how that second boarding house came to be is pretty interesting. She got access to that house because she became friends with a man named Ricardo Odorica, who bought a rundown two-story Victorian house on 1426 F Street. Ricardo met Dorothea at a bar, and the first thing to come out of her mouth was, I want to rent the second floor of your house. This puzzled him because she had never seen the house. She didn't know what it looked like. It was in terrible shape. But she insisted, so he brought her over to meet the family, and they just immediately kind of became enmeshed with her. His children really loved Dorothea and saw her kind of as a godmother, grandmother, just someone that they really looked up to, which is interesting considering how she completely rejected her own children. Eventually, Ricardo and his family decided to move to a better neighborhood, but Dorothea was still technically renting the house, and half of that house became the boarding house.
I want us to skip now to November 1988. Was anyone suspicious? Were people starting to talk? Like, this was a house in a very suburban area. Were there rumours before things started to actually unravel?
As for chatter among neighbors, no, it did not seem that anyone suspected anything. Among the tenants themselves, some of them were starting to wonder, like, hey, that guy I was friends with, he just disappeared. And they asked the landlady, and she'd be like, oh, they just moved out. But they didn't want to rock the boat. This was like the best living conditions they can get. So they did not want to potentially risk losing that. But people started getting suspicious when a man named Bert Montoya, who was a mentally ill homeless man who had a social worker named Judy Moyse. So Judy brought him over, and everything looked great. Dorothea spoke to him in Spanish, promised to cook him like his favorite meals, and like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting, just very, very warm and friendly. And it finally looked like he found a place that he belonged.
And basically he went missing, didn't he?
Yes. Judy Moyse stopped hearing from him, and Dorothea stopped communicating with her. She told a bizarre story that Bert had gone to visit her family in Mexico, something that Judy thought was very strange and not very healthy, considering that he had just gotten situated in this boarding house. And a lot of the tenants that she took in were Mexican, but he was Costa Rican, so it's not like he had any family or anything in Mexico. And it's strange to send a tenant to live with your family.
So the police turn up at the boarding house. They start questioning Dorothea, asking where Bert is. How quickly did things move from there? Because it seems like they started basically digging up her backyard quite quickly after that.
Yes. The police came essentially just to do a welfare check on Bert because Dorothea had gotten a phone call from someone claiming to have been Bert's brother-in-law, saying that Bert was fine. And this was very strange to Judy because Bert was essentially estranged from his family. Nobody knew where they were. So this just came off as extremely suspicious. So she called the police, who came to do a welfare check. And Dorothea played the part saying, oh, well, he's fine. Like, he's with his family now. Like, there's nothing to worry about. And she's a very convincing person. The other tenants all said, yeah, he moved out. He's not here anymore. Like, he's fine. But one of them, in secret, handed them a note that said, she wants me to lie to you. They took that tenant to the police station where he would be safe to speak. And he basically said, yeah, she's been digging a lot of holes in the yard. So Detective Cabreras, who was the person in charge of all this investigation, he had to play like this good cop role where he came to the house and he was like, oh yeah, we want to get the social worker off my back and off your back. So can we just dig a hole so like we can like placate her? And he had not really been expecting to find anything. So it was very strange when he found what he described to be something that looked like beef jerky. He could not get it free, so he jumped in and wrestled it free and was like, oh my God, this is a human leg.
Ugh.
And it had gotten to that point of decomposition because this was a body that had been there for months.
So it couldn't be Bert.
No, the person that it belonged to was far too small, and later it was determined to have belonged to a petite woman.
So they've found a body in Dorothea's backyard, but can they arrest her? What happens next?
So she's technically not under arrest because she said, I didn't bury that there. That probably could have been there beforehand. As suspicious as it looked, they did not have enough to arrest her. So while the digging continued, she asked the detective, can I go to a nearby hotel to meet my nephew for coffee? And he was put in a really difficult position where he did not want to let her go for obvious reasons, but he could not hold her back and create more legal trouble down the line. So he let her go. And when they dug up more bodies, they were like, oh my God, we got to get her back. She was gone.
So they found 7 bodies in total. But at what point did they realise, hang on, we've got to go and get Dorothea? We actually have reason to arrest her now.
It was after they found Bert, because Bert was the missing person that they had come for, and he was under her care. So that's immediately when they realized something very, very bad happened here. And they went looking for her, but she was gone. She was on the way to Los Angeles.
So how did they manage to track her down in the end?
The news came out that not only was this landlady killing her tenants, but also that the police fumbled everything by letting her go. So that immediately became nationwide news. In Los Angeles at that time was a man who saw Dorothea at a bar. At this point, he did not recognize her. He had not seen her in the news. Later, when he returned home, he saw her and reported her to the police and told them, yeah, she's staying at the Royal Viking Motel. So they went and surrounded the area and arrested her and brought her back to Sacramento in a jet.
I think a really interesting detail to add here is on her arrest, there was a TV station that managed to get a quick interview in, and she said something, and this line has just stayed with me. She said, "I used to be a good person at one time."
Yes.
Because she doesn't end up admitting to anything, does she?
No, she never did. The most she would ever admit to would be forgery. But I don't think you get a line like that if you just admit to forgery. It's not a great thing to do, but that's something that you say you've got something weighing on your consciousness.
Yeah, it's more sinister.
Yes.
So what other clues did police find in her home?
There was tons and tons of bottles of medication, including, I believe it's pronounced Dalmane, a sleeping medication. One tenant who was later found in the yard, Dorothy Miller, who suffered from night terrors, got this medication to help her sleep. And it was determined that this is one of the drugs that she used to kill her tenants. Aside from the medication, there was a room upstairs that had been carpeted over that they later found had a very big stain on the floor under the carpet and a very foul smell. It was determined that this is likely where she killed them.
So what would she do?
Her go-to appears to be drugging them, a combination of the sleeping medication and basically anything else that she can get her hands on, such as like codeine. It was determined that some of her tenants, she put the medication in their food. And once they started losing consciousness or becoming paralyzed, she would take them to this specific room in her house. And it's believed that she had help from other tenants because, she was only 5'4", and she portrayed herself as this frail old granny. She's not going to be like hauling someone up a flight of stairs. So she had other tenants who would help her, whether it be by like carrying the body or dismembering them, because there was one tenant that was found dismembered and I believe her head was never found.
Do we know who helped? I saw a report that Bert might have been involved.
He may have been. It was never determined like an exact person because some of them might have just dug the holes and not known what the hole was for. And I do believe that Bert may have been one of them because this is going back to the original boarding house, the first one. Now, this is something that has never, like, in any official capacity been corroborated, but there were reports that she had help from one specific tenant who was only known as Chief. He was a very quiet alcoholic who basically became her lackey. And while it's not believed that she actually murdered anyone around this time, other tenants said that Chief just suddenly disappeared after he stopped being useful to her. So she may have had some of her tenants dig these holes not knowing what they were for.
So why was she killing people? Was it to get their checks?
Some, she wanted to keep the ruse going for as long as she could. And she couldn't do that if these tenants complained to someone, well, she's taking all my money. Because she took every penny that they got. And if one of them expressed that they were unhappy about this, she would have them killed. Some, she had them killed just because she found them annoying. She didn't want to care for them anymore. The first victim, Leona Carpenter, who was in her 70s, had suffered from tumors in the brain, so she needed a lot of care, and Dorothea just decided that she did not want to deal with that anymore. And the previously mentioned Dorothy Miller had night terrors, and that also annoyed Dorothea because she would wake up very agitated, very upset. And it's a very sad story, this specific victim, because Dorothy really liked Dorothea, really wanted to get close to her, really saw her as a friend, and Dorothea was just done with her, just found her annoying and wanted to get rid of her.
Well, she was killing the most vulnerable members of our society, often older people as well. It's a very callous kind of crime.
Yes.
She was charged with 9 counts initially, so 9 counts of murder, but she was only convicted of 3. How did that happen? What was her story to the court?
Well, she always maintained her innocence. She always maintained that her only crime was forgery. And she had done such a good job of creating this image of herself as a philanthropist that even the jury was swayed. They had a hard time trying to figure out who this woman really was, considering all the good she had done for the community, because it's really difficult to really paint a picture of everything she did, because not only was she very charitable towards the homeless, she also was a very influential person among Sacramento's Latino community. These are like people of all walks of life, just found her so inspirational that the jury was kind of blindsided by this, that they had a hard time believing that she, 1, could do these murders, and 2, could have done them all on her own.
Was she convicted of Bert's murder? Was he one of the 3?
No, he was not. She was only convicted of 3 counts of murder on Benjamin Fink, Leona Carpenter, and Dorothy Miller.
But it was quite a close result, wasn't it? Wasn't it just one juror? Was that a stalemate?
Yes. It was one juror who could not make up their mind, and later could not make up their mind for what kind of sentence she was to receive.
And what was she sentenced with?
In 1993, after the trial, she was spared the death penalty, but she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And there she spent the rest of her life until 2011, where she died of natural causes.
And she was in her 80s by then?
Yes, early 80s.
Do we know about her experience in prison?
She was very well liked in prison. Other inmates saw her as this warm maternal figure. I believe some called her mom, some called her grandma. It's like wherever she went, she really wanted to create this image of herself as someone that could be admired. And this did not stop in prison, even though there was nothing monetarily to gain from it.
And with a trail of bodies behind her.
Yeah, so it really shows how convincing she could be, that even after these 3 murder convictions, she still made people feel safe and welcome, someone that could be confided in, someone that they could trust and look up to.
What about the victims? I know a lot of these people didn't have huge family connections, but 9 people dead, that's a lot of families that have been splintered apart. Do we know about the ramifications, the kind of waves that she made in those families?
Well, Ruth Monroe's family, who she was not originally considered one of her victims until the news broke and her children started putting 2 and 2 together. Ruth Monroe had 2 sons and 1 daughter. They kind of made it their mission to get Ruth to be recognized as one of Dorothy's victims, and they did fail in that regard. So that's something that they had to deal with in the aftermath, is knowing that this woman killed their mother and she never faced justice for it.
You've written a whole book on this topic. What fascinates you about this case? And after doing so much research into it, is there anything that stays with you from it?
I went into this book expecting a very clear-cut division of her character. When it comes to serial killers, it's very easy to say that everything they did in their normal life was an act. Going into Dorothea Puente's case, I really thought it was going to be more of the same. I thought it was going to be obvious that all of her good deeds were just an act. By the time I finished the book, I still had not had a definitive answer to, was everything an act, if that makes sense. Because even after everything, a lot of people still sang her praises, saying that she basically saved their lives. And I believe that there was a part of her that genuinely wanted to do good. When you go back to that quote of hers that you mentioned, I used to be a very good person at one point, I do believe that she believed that. I think she wanted to do good. I believe she wanted to make a difference, but her love of money was something that just clouded her judgment, as well as the fact that she had no true sense of who she was. She wanted to be seen as a good person by any means necessary. You know that quote, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions"? I think she really embodies that. She was going to use anyone she could to make herself look good. And to make herself look good, she wanted to help other people.
Thanks to Jeannie for assisting us to tell this story. You can find her book, The Corpse Collector, the true story of Dorothea Puente, linked in our show notes if you'd like to read more about the case. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast, hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Moylan. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.